A 21-year-old woman, driven off her own throne, hunted by her brother's soldiers, once had herself tied inside a sack of bedding and carried on a servant's shoulder straight through an enemy palace, past the very guards ordered to arrest her on sight. At the end of that walk was the most powerful man alive. Within a year, she had a child by him and had turned the machinery of Rome to her own purpose. And almost everything you think you know about her after that is wrong. We call her a seductress, a beauty who ruined great men with a look. The Romans made sure of that. But ancient sources talk about her beauty, but none actually describe her. From coinage of the times, she was not a particularly attractive woman, and they talk about her charm, wit, education, ability to convince, and ambition. The woman under the legend was something far more dangerous than a pretty face. She was one of the sharpest political minds of her century, and she outplayed not one master of Rome, but two. Her name was Cleopatra. And this detail should stop you. Nearly everything written about her was written by the people who destroyed her. Everything we know about her comes from a Roman vantage, and nothing at all from Egyptian sources. Nothing. Absolutely no literature about her from Egyptian sources has survived from antiquity. Which means the woman who ruled the richest kingdom on the Mediterranean for over 2 decades comes down to us entirely through the pens of her enemies. And yet, even they couldn't hide how frightened of her they were. If you enjoy history told the way it actually happened, the real people, the real decisions, none of the Hollywood polish, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely helps this kind of storytelling reach more people. Now, back to Egypt. To understand how one woman could bend Rome, you first have to understand the trap she was handed the day she became queen. Because Egypt in her time was not the Egypt of the pyramid builders. Those pharaohs were already ancient history. The Great Pyramid was older to Cleopatra than Cleopatra is to us. Sit with that for a moment. When she looked at the pyramids, she was looking at monuments more distant from her own life than the fall of the Roman Empire is from ours. The Egypt she inherited was ruled by Greeks, foreigners. Her family, the Ptolemies, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals who grabbed Egypt when Alexander died and never let go. For 3 centuries they sat on the Nile as an occupying royal house, speaking Greek, marrying each other, and treating the native Egyptians almost as tenants in their own country. And their capital was the wonder of the world, Alexandria. Picture a city built to overwhelm you before you even landed. Rising over the harbor stood one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Pharos, the 440-foot lighthouse that guided ships safely into the great harbor for nearly 2 millennia. And researchers mapping the old royal quarter believe the palace of Cleopatra lies just offshore. That lighthouse was taller than a 40-story building, roughly the height of a modern skyscraper, and it was the first thing sailors saw, a wall of white marble throwing light across the sea. It was a calculated, colossal piece of political propaganda. In the ancient world, height equaled power, and this ancient skyscraper was the first thing sailors would see long before they could make out the city itself. It was a statement of ultimate wealth, technological mastery, and divine-like power. Behind that lighthouse was money on a scale hard to imagine. Alexandria was the New York of its day. Scientists uncovering its ruins described the architectural sublimity, economic muscle, and intellectual dominance of an urban center that ranked second only to ancient Rome. Grain, papyrus, glass, spices from India and Arabia flowed through its docks. The famous library sat at the heart of it, pulling scholars from across the known world. If you wanted to know something in the ancient Mediterranean, this was where the knowledge lived. So the throne Cleopatra took was, on paper, one of the great prizes of the world. And that's exactly why it was a trap. Because there was a shadow lying over all of it. A shadow with a name. Rome. By her lifetime, Egypt had become something humiliating. Rich, magnificent, and completely dependent on the goodwill of a foreign republic that could swallow it whenever it chose. And her own father had made it that way. He is one of the more pathetic figures in the family's history. A king so fond of playing the flute that his own people nicknamed him the flute player. Ptolemy XII was king of Ptolemaic Egypt and father of Cleopatra. His illegitimate birth and drunkenness inspired ridicule, and he reigned for nearly 30 years, bribing leaders of the Roman Republic like Pompey and Julius Caesar to prevent the Roman annexation of Egypt. Think about what that means. To keep the wolves of Rome from taking his kingdom, her father spent his reign buying them off. And the bribes were not small. In 60 BC, Ptolemy traveled to Rome, where the first triumvirate of Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar had just taken power, and paid Pompey and Caesar 6,000 talents, an enormous sum, equivalent to the total annual revenue of Egypt. Read that again. He handed over an entire year's income of the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean just for a promise that Rome would recognize him as king. It's like a billionaire emptying his whole fortune to be told he's allowed to keep his house. Where did the money come from? Where money always comes from when a ruler runs out. Loans. And the people. Ptolemy raised taxes and took loans from Roman bankers to secure Roman support. And as debts mounted, he shifted the blame for taxation to his Roman creditors by appointing his main creditor as the Minister of Finance. He borrowed from Roman financiers against the future of his own country. Then, when the taxes he squeezed out of Egyptians turned the streets against him, he put a Roman face in charge of the collecting so the hatred would land somewhere else. It was cynical. It was clever. And it left his children a poisoned inheritance, because debt to Rome was not just debt. It was a leash. Increasingly, Ptolemy had recourse to loans from Roman bankers, which gave the Romans even more leverage over his regime, and meant that the fate of Egypt became an increasingly immediate issue in Roman politics. Every drachma he owed was one more reason for a Roman general to march in and collect. The kingdom Cleopatra would take was a beautiful, gleaming thing, sitting on top of a debt so large it could be called in as a conquest at any moment. And there was more. Her father didn't just borrow from Rome, he rented Roman soldiers to keep himself on the throne. When his own people threw him out, he went to Rome, begged, bribed, and came back at the head of a Roman army. He regained power in 55 BC with Roman military aid, executing his own daughter for leading the opposition. Notice that last part, his own daughter. Cleopatra's older sister had taken the throne while he was away. When he returned with Roman swords behind him, he killed her. That is the family Cleopatra grew up in. This was not a family in any sense you'd recognize. This was a dynasty that treated murdering its own as a form of politics. Few ruling families have been as dysfunctional, perverse, or given to more intrafamilial murders than the Ptolemaic dynasty. Fathers killed sons, sons killed mothers, brothers killed sisters, and married the ones they didn't kill. I want to be careful here, because the ancient world loved a lurid story, and the Romans loved painting the Ptolemies as monsters. But this part is not exaggeration. One earlier king of the line, and I still find this hard to say plainly, had his own son murdered and dismembered, and the head, hands, and feet were boxed and shipped to Alexandria, timed to arrive on the queen's birthday, and she reportedly displayed the box. That is the household in which a little girl learned how power worked. In the Ptolemaic court, the fastest way to lose your life was to trust the person sleeping down the hall. Put yourself in that palace as a child. You share your dinners with people who might, on any given year, decide you are in their way. You learn very young that a sibling is not family. A sibling is a competitor with a claim to your throne. You learn to read a room before you learn to read the poets. And Cleopatra learned all of it. Which brings us to the girl behind the myth. Because the strangest thing about Cleopatra is not the seduction the movies sold you. It's that she was, by the standards of any age, a genuine scholar. She grew up inside that library, that machine of knowledge, and she used it. She was, in fact, one of the greatest intellectuals of her time, educated by the leading scholars of the Hellenistic world and studying at the Museion in Alexandria, which included the famous library. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, rhetoric, philosophy, the full education of the ancient elite. And then the detail that everyone quotes, because it's genuinely astonishing. The languages. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, she was the first member of the Ptolemaic dynasty to learn the Egyptian language, and she did not stop there. She spoke at least 9 languages in total and could converse with almost any foreign visitor without an interpreter. Now, historians rightly urge caution here. Plutarch may have been listing the peoples around her kingdom rather than counting fluent tongues, and some doubt she truly mastered every one. But even the skeptics agree on the core fact, and it's the one that matters most. Consider why it matters. For 300 years, her family had ruled Egypt without bothering to speak the language of the Egyptians. Think about how staggering that is. 3 centuries of kings sitting on the throne of a people whose words they never learned. The Ptolemies were an occupying dynasty. They had taken Egypt as spoils of war and ruled it as Greek speakers from a Greek-speaking court, while the vast majority of Egypt's millions of people spoke a different language than their rulers. It's as if a foreign family moved into a country, ran it for 300 years, and never once learned to say good morning to the people they governed. Cleopatra broke that. She was the first of the Ptolemies to speak Egyptian and spent money freely to support traditional Egyptian religious cults. That was not a hobby. That was strategy. In a family that had spent 3 centuries as aloof foreigners, she alone understood something obvious and yet somehow invisible to all her ancestors. If you actually speak to your people, they might actually stand with you. She had herself portrayed in the ancient Egyptian style, honored the old gods, spoke to the priests at their temples in their own words. She studied the Egyptian language and had portraits of herself painted in the Egyptian technique, and she gained her countrymen's respect as a result. So set aside the image of the temptress lounging on a barge. The real weapon Cleopatra carried into every room was her mind, and the Romans knew it. Even Plutarch, writing generations later, and no friend of hers, gave it away. He said her beauty was nothing that would stop you in the street, but that being in a room with her was something else entirely. Her presence, combined with the persuasiveness of her discourse and the character somehow diffused about her behavior, had something stimulating about it. There was sweetness also in the tones of her voice. That's not a description of a face. That's a description of a mind at work. And you have to ask why the Romans worked so hard to reduce her to a body. The answer is not flattering to them. A brilliant foreign queen who outthought Rome's greatest men was a terrifying thing for Roman writers to admit. Far more comfortable to say she bewitched them. Roman propaganda was quick to paint Cleopatra as little more than a seductress who forged her position in the beds of powerful men. She was a powerful and accomplished ruler, but historical accounts discredited her, minimized her successes, and vastly exaggerated her indiscretions. The Seductress myth wasn't a compliment. It was a way of taking her power away from her after her death, when she could no longer answer back. Now, the throne itself. Her father died, and his will made two of his children joint rulers. Cleopatra, around 18, and her brother, a boy of 10. In 51 BC, when Ptolemy XII died, Cleopatra took the throne, ruling with her brother Ptolemy XIII. Because he was 10 years old when their rule began, Cleopatra was the dominant partner in the relationship. And this is where the Ptolemaic family reaches a level of strangeness that even now is hard to say out loud. She didn't just co-rule with her little brother. By the tradition of her house, she was married to him. When her father died, she became co-regent with her 10-year-old brother, to whom she was also married according to tradition. A grown woman, wed by law to a child, sharing a crown neither of them was willing to share. The marriage was a fiction, of course, a dynastic formality, keeping the bloodline and the throne inside one family, which the Ptolemies had been doing for generations. The dynasty practiced incestuous marriage. Monarchs married a sibling or other close relative to be their co-ruler, but the rivalry underneath it was entirely real. Because a boy of 10 does not run a kingdom, the men who stand behind him do. And the men standing behind her little brother had no intention of letting his older sister run anything. At the center of them was the boy king's regent, a court official who effectively controlled the child and, through him, the throne. Ptolemy's youth rendered him dependent on influential advisors, notably the eunuch Pothinus, who acted as de facto regent and progressively maneuvered to elevate the king's status at Cleopatra's expense. To this man and his circle, Cleopatra was a problem. She was too capable, too independent, too clearly the real power. Learn this one name too, because he is the hand behind almost everything that follows. The regent, working through a puppet child, out to erase the queen. At first, Cleopatra simply overpowered them by acting like a monarch. In the spring of 48 BC, Ptolemy and his regent attempted to depose Cleopatra due to her increasing status as queen. Her face appeared on minted coins, while her brother's name was omitted on official documents. Do you see the move she made? She put her own face on the money and left her brother's name off the paperwork. In the ancient world, coins were the ultimate broadcast. Every hand in the kingdom held her portrait. She was quietly, systematically, writing the boy out of his own reign. The men around the child struck back, and they had a weapon she couldn't beat. They had the boy, they had the palace, and they had Alexandria. Her brother and his regent managed to force Cleopatra to flee to Syria, but she soon organized her own army, and a civil war began in Egypt. Stop and picture where she is now. Not long ago, she was a queen with her face on the coins of the richest kingdom on earth. Now she is a fugitive, run out of her own capital, out of her own country, with a price on her head from a court run by her 10-year-old husband-brother. Most people in that position disappear into history. A footnote, another Ptolemy who lost. She did the opposite. She went into the desert and built an army. Cleopatra fled to Syria, intending to raise an army and return as ruler of Egypt. Think about the sheer nerve of that. A woman in her early 20s, freshly overthrown, with no throne and no treasury behind her, walking into the borderlands and persuading hardened men to follow her back toward the kingdom that had just spat her out. Fleeing eastward to Syria, a Ptolemaic dependency, Cleopatra mobilized mercenaries and local levies, amassing an army to launch a counteroffensive and restore her co-regency. And it wasn't just her brother against her now. Her family being what it was, another sibling smelled opportunity in the chaos. Her younger sister, who would soon start reaching for the crown herself. This is the true shape of her world. Not a queen with loyal family at her back, but one woman surrounded by siblings who each wanted her dead so the throne could be theirs. A brother in the palace scheming to erase her. A sister maneuvering to take whatever was left. Advisors playing all of them against each other. She marched her new army toward Egypt and hit a wall. Her brother's forces were waiting, dug in at the eastern gateway of the country, blocking the road home. She returned with an army, but her advance to Alexandria was blocked by her brother's forces mobilized to fight against her, so she camped outside Pelusium in the eastern Nile Delta. So there she sat, two Egyptian armies frozen in the sand, facing each other across the desert. A queen who had gambled everything to come home, unable to take the last steps. A boy king in Alexandria whose handlers wanted her erased for good, and neither side able to break the other. It was a stalemate that could have swallowed her whole. She could have died out there in the dust, one more failed Ptolemy, and the world would barely have noticed. And then, from across the sea, into that frozen standoff, came something no one in Egypt had planned for. A different war entirely, Rome's own, came crashing down onto the Egyptian coast. A defeated Roman general, running for his life, and close behind him, hunting him, the single most powerful man in the world, was about to step off a ship onto Egyptian sand and walk straight into the middle of Cleopatra's war. The most powerful man in the world arrived in Egypt chasing a corpse he didn't yet know was a corpse. Julius Caesar had just shattered his great rival on a battlefield in Greece. That rival, once Rome's most celebrated general, the man Cleopatra's own father had bribed to protect Egypt, had fled the wreck of his army and run to the one kingdom that owed him a debt. He came to Alexandria expecting sanctuary. He had been the boy king's guardian on paper, a friend of the dynasty. Surely Egypt would shelter him. Egypt cut off his head. The men running the boy king made a cold, brutal calculation. Sheltering a loser who had just been crushed by Caesar would bring Caesar's wrath down on Alexandria. Handing Caesar the head of his defeated enemy might buy his gratitude instead. So when the great Roman stepped ashore, the boy king's people met him with a gift. They presented Pompey's severed head and his signet ring to Caesar, expecting his approval. They had misread him completely. Caesar, who had chased this man across the whole Mediterranean and might well have killed him in the end, is said to have turned away from the grisly offering in disgust and wept. Whatever he truly felt, the political meaning was plain. These Egyptian courtiers had murdered a Roman consul, a man who had once been Caesar's son-in-law, and thought they'd done him a favor. He had them show him where the body was. He took the ring. And then Caesar did something the boy king's handlers never expected. He didn't sail away satisfied. He moved into the palace and stayed. Put yourself in that court now. A foreign general has walked into your capital with a few thousand soldiers, seized the royal quarter as if he owns it, and announced that he, an outsider, will settle the Egyptian civil war between the queen and her brother. He was there partly for money, the enormous old debts Cleopatra's father had piled up, and partly because whoever controlled Egypt's grain and gold controlled a piece of Rome's future. He summoned both siblings to appear before him and make their case. And this is the moment Cleopatra's entire life had prepared her for. She was still stuck out in the desert, blocked from her own capital by her brother's army. If she tried to enter Alexandria openly, she'd be seized or killed before she ever reached the palace. The whole city was in her brother's hands. But Caesar was inside that palace. Caesar could undo everything the regent had done to her with a word. She had to get to him. The problem was physically impossible. An entire hostile army and a hostile court stood between her and the one man who could save her. So she solved the impossible problem the way she solved everything, with nerve and imagination. According to Plutarch, she took a small boat at nightfall and slipped into the harbor with a single trusted servant. Then she had herself wrapped inside a large sack, a length of bedding, the kind used to carry laundry or a mattress, and the servant tied it up, hoisted the bundle onto his shoulder, and simply carried her in through the palace gates, past the guards, straight to Caesar's rooms. The oldest and most famous version says it was a rolled-up carpet, but the earliest sources describe a sack of bedding, a bag for sleeping gear. Either way, understand what you're picturing. A queen of Egypt, folded up inside a bundle of cloth, smuggled like contraband through the halls of her own palace, past the very men ordered to kill her. And when the servant set the bundle down in front of the most powerful man in the world and it opened, out stepped Cleopatra, roughly 21 years old, alone, uninvited, having just wagered her life on a laundry sack. I want to be careful about the legend here, because Hollywood turned this into a scene of pure seduction. That's the Roman lens again, reducing her to a body. But look at what actually happened in the room, because it's far more impressive than a striptease. She had gambled everything on getting 5 uninterrupted minutes to make her case, and she made it brilliantly. Plutarch tells us Caesar was captivated first by the sheer audacity of the stunt, and then, once they talked, by her charm and the force of her mind. By the next morning, the calculation was done. Caesar had decided the Queen of Egypt would keep her throne. And in the process, the two of them had become lovers. Think about the sheer scale of what that single night accomplished. A defeated fugitive who days earlier had no throne, no army she could get home, and a death sentence over her head, had just made the master of the Roman world her ally and her partner. She had walked into a locked country in a sack, and walked out, in effect, its queen again. That is not seduction. That is one of the boldest political gambles anyone has ever pulled off. But the men who had thrown her out did not simply accept it. And now the story turns, fast and dangerous. When morning came and the boy king discovered his sister was inside the palace, reconciled to Caesar, back in the game, he was furious. The regent behind him understood exactly what it meant. Caesar had a handful of soldiers. Alexandria was a huge, seething city, and the boy king's army was enormous by comparison. So the regent made his move. The royal army surrounded the palace quarter and tried to trap Caesar and Cleopatra inside and destroy them both. This is where the polished love story becomes something grim and terrifying. A siege. For a whole winter, Caesar and Cleopatra were pinned in the palace district by a hostile army and a hostile city, cut off, badly outnumbered, fighting street to street through Alexandria. Imagine being sealed into a few blocks of a vast city, everyone outside your walls trying to kill you, food and water precarious, the enemy pressing at every door. The greatest general of the age and the sharpest queen of the age, both trapped like animals. The fighting swung between the palace and the harbor, and at one point Caesar's position nearly collapsed. To keep the enemy fleet from cutting him off, he ordered the Egyptian ships in the harbor set on fire. The blaze spread, and here we reach one of the most haunting and most argued over moments in the whole story. The fire that Caesar set in the harbor is blamed, in several ancient accounts, for spreading into the city and damaging the buildings near the docks, including part of the great collection of the Library of Alexandria. Sit with that image. The most famous storehouse of knowledge in the ancient world, the beating brain of the Mediterranean, the place that had educated Cleopatra herself, scorched by a fire lit to win a street battle. Now, historians argue fiercely about how bad the damage really was. Some ancient writers say a huge number of scrolls burned in warehouses near the harbor. Others think the main library survived, and it was bookstores by the docks that went up. What's certain is that fire tore through the harbor district, while two of history's most famous figures were trapped a few streets away, fighting for their lives. The fighting at the water's edge got so desperate that Caesar himself, according to the ancient accounts, ended up in the sea, forced to swim for it from a collapsing position, holding documents above the waves with one hand. Whether every detail is true or embroidered, the picture the sources agree on is clear. The conqueror of the Roman world came within a hair of dying in a harbor in Egypt, fighting a civil war that wasn't even his own. What saved them was time and reinforcements. Caesar held the palace quarter through the winter, and eventually relief forces marched overland to Egypt and broke the siege. In the final battle, the boy king's army was crushed. The child who had tried to erase his sister fled and drowned in the Nile, his heavy golden armor, the story goes, dragging him under. And with that, the civil war that had begun in the desert ended in the river. The regent who had schemed against Cleopatra from the start was already dead, executed on Caesar's orders during the siege. So look at where she stands now. Every rival who had driven her out is dead or ruined. Her 10-year-old husband-brother is at the bottom of the Nile, and the master of Rome has personally put her back on the throne of Egypt, with his army holding the country steady behind her. The fugitive in the sack is now the undisputed queen, and the most powerful man alive is both her lover and her guarantor. And then she showed the world exactly what she had gained. Once the fighting was over, Caesar did not immediately rush back to Rome. Instead, the sources describe an extraordinary journey. The two of them traveled up the Nile together on a royal barge. Picture that boat. Not a warship, a floating palace, gilded and shaded, drifting south past the great temples of a civilization already thousands of years old, with an escort of Egyptian vessels strung out behind. On board, the Queen of Egypt and the man who had just made himself master of Rome. This was not a holiday. Every part of it was a message, and Cleopatra knew exactly who was meant to read it. To her own people, sailing the sacred river in the company of Rome's ruler said one thing: "Your queen is protected by the greatest power on earth. Do not test her." To the priests and the old cities of Egypt, it said the throne was secure. And there was a piece of theater in it aimed at Rome, too, though a dangerous one, because Romans hated the very idea of kings, and here was their leader, gliding down a foreign river like a pharaoh's consort. But the real message was already growing where no propaganda could match it. Cleopatra was pregnant. And not long after, she gave birth to a son, a boy she named for his father, whom the Alexandrians called Caesarion, Little Caesar. She let it be known, loudly, that this child was the son of Julius Caesar. Understand the weight of that claim. Caesar was the most powerful man in the world, and he had no legitimate son, only a daughter who had died. Now the Queen of Egypt was holding up an infant and telling the world that the blood of Rome's master ran in the veins of the heir to Egypt. In one child, she had joined the richest kingdom of the Mediterranean to the strongest man in Rome. Whether Caesar publicly, formally acknowledged the boy is something historians still debate.
But Cleopatra made sure everyone knew the name, and everyone drew the conclusion. It was the most audacious dynastic move imaginable. A queen quietly positioning her son as a bridge between Egypt and Rome, and perhaps, one day, as something more. And then she did something even bolder. She went to Rome itself. While Caesar returned to the capital and to the business of ruling the Roman world, Cleopatra followed, bringing her son and settling into a grand villa Caesar owned on the far bank of the Tiber, just outside the city proper.
Think of a foreign queen taking up residence in a mansion at the edge of the capital, in full view of the whole Roman establishment, as the guest of the man who now effectively ran the state. It was breathtaking, and to conservative Romans, it was outrageous. Because Rome, remember, was a republic that had thrown out its kings centuries before and had built its entire identity on the hatred of monarchy. The idea of a king was, to the Roman elite, practically an obscenity. And here was Caesar, already accused of wanting to make himself a king, openly hosting a foreign queen, with a child she claimed was his, right across the river. The whispers were poison. To his enemies, Cleopatra was living proof that Caesar meant to crown himself and found a dynasty, maybe even move the seat of power to Alexandria. Everything they feared about him, they now saw walking around in the shape of an Egyptian queen. And then Caesar poured fuel on the fire. He had a golden statue of Cleopatra placed inside a temple in Rome, a temple to the goddess of love, in the heart of the city. Let that land for a moment. A gilded image of a living foreign queen, standing in a Roman temple beside the goddess, in a city that considered kingship an abomination. It was an honor no Roman woman had ever received. It effectively presented her as divine, as a queen, as something no Roman was supposed to bow to. To Caesar's allies, it was a flattering gesture to an important ally. To his enemies, it was a confession of monarchy, of ambition, of everything the Republic was built to prevent. She had done it. A woman who a few years earlier had been smuggled through her own palace in a sack, now had her golden likeness in a temple of Rome, a son she called Caesar's, and the ear of the most powerful man on earth. She had outmaneuvered her family, outlasted a siege, and turned the ruler of the Roman world into the guarantor of her throne and the father of her child. From the outside, it looked like she had won everything, and that, in the ruthless logic of history, is almost always the moment the ground opens up. Because the same fears her presence stirred, the fear of kings, the fear that Caesar was reaching for a crown, were curdling into something lethal inside the Roman Senate. The men who saw Caesar as a would-be monarch, and Cleopatra as the queen who would help him become one, decided the Republic could only be saved one way. On a day in the middle of March, in a hall packed with senators, Caesar was surrounded and stabbed to death, struck down by a mob of the very men who governed Rome, some of them people he had pardoned and trusted. The most powerful man in the world, the queen's lover, her protector, the father of her son, the single pillar holding up everything she had built, was dead on the floor in an afternoon. And Cleopatra was still there, in Rome, in the villa across the Tiber, in a city that had just murdered her protector precisely because of what he'd become, and what she represented. Overnight, she went from being the honored guest of the master of the world to a foreign queen stranded in the capital of her enemies, surrounded by men who saw her and her half-Roman son as a threat that had to be dealt with. The golden statue in the temple was now a target. The child she'd named Caesar was now a name that could get them both killed. She had gambled everything on one man, and that man
was gone. She got out of Rome and sailed home to Egypt, back to the palace on the harbor, to think and to survive, because the game was very far from over. Caesar's death did not settle the Roman world. It blew it apart.
Power was now up for grabs among his heirs and his killers, and a new civil war was already gathering. Into that chaos, in time, would come another Roman. A very different kind of man from Caesar. Not a cold, calculating conqueror who used Egypt and moved on. This one was a soldier and a reveler, a man ruled by appetite as much as ambition. The sort who, once he fell into Cleopatra's orbit, would not do the sensible thing and leave. He would stay. He would stay far, far too long. And in the end, he would burn down with her. The Roman world did not mourn Caesar for long. It tore itself into pieces over who would inherit him. When the dust settled from the wars that followed his murder, the empire came down to two men who could not stand each other. One was Caesar's teenage grandnephew and adopted heir, a cold, sickly, calculating young man who held the West, and above all, Rome itself. The other was Caesar's old right-hand general, a battle-hardened soldier with a taste for wine and spectacle, who took the wealthy East. Between them, they split the entire Roman world in two, like two chief executives carving a global company down the middle, one taking the head office and the home market, the other taking the richer, more glamorous overseas territories, each certain the whole thing would eventually be his alone. And the East, the general's half, sat right on Cleopatra's doorstep. Egypt was the golden prize inside his territory, the grain, the gold, the treasure of the Ptolemies. Sooner or later, the man now ruling Rome's eastern provinces was going to have to deal with the Queen of Egypt. He dealt with her by putting her on trial. During the wars after Caesar's death, Cleopatra had, at least in Roman eyes, backed the wrong side. So the general summoned her to answer for it, ordered her to appear before him in a city in the east and explain herself, like a defendant called before a judge. A lesser ruler would have arrived nervous and apologetic, begging forgiveness. Cleopatra staged an entrance the 21st century would still be talking about. Plutarch left us the scene, and it is one of the great set pieces of the ancient world. She came up the river to meet him on a barge with a gilded stern, its sails dyed purple, its oars silver, dipping in time to flutes and pipes and harps. She herself lay beneath a canopy embroidered with gold, dressed as the goddess of love, with beautiful attendants arranged around her like sea nymphs, and perfume drifting off the boat so thick the crowds on the riverbanks could smell her coming before they could see her. Word ran through the city that the goddess of love had arrived to feast with the god of wine. The general had summoned her as a subject on trial. She arrived as a deity, and she flipped the entire meeting. The man who had called her to account ended up as her guest. He'd meant to judge her. Instead, he was dazzled, out-hosted, out-thought, exactly as Caesar had been in the palace years before. Understand the pattern here, because this is the real Cleopatra, not a woman who seduced powerful men with her body, but one who understood theater, wealth, and psychology better than anyone in the room, and who used a spectacle worth a fortune as a calculated instrument of statecraft. She turned an interrogation into a courtship, and by the time it was over, the master of the Roman East was following her home to Alexandria. That was the winter he was supposed to be a Roman general. Instead, he became something Rome would no longer recognize. He came to Egypt, and he did not leave. Not that winter, not the next. He settled into the palace on the harbor and into Cleopatra's world. and the years began to blur. She bore him children, twins, a boy and a girl, and later a third child. The Roman commander who was meant to be governing half an empire was instead living as the consort of an Egyptian queen in a Greek palace, raising a family with a foreign monarch. The two of them founded a private drinking club, and the name they gave it tells you everything about the atmosphere of those years. The ancient sources call it the Society of the Inimitable Livers, a company devoted to feasting and pleasure on a scale that beggared belief, each member trying to outdo the last. Plutarch's own grandfather, he tells us, knew a physician in training in Alexandria at the time who was once shown the royal kitchens, where he saw 8 wild boars roasting at once. Not for some vast banquet, but for a small supper, because the cooks never knew the exact minute the queen and the general would call for the meal, and everything had to be ready to serve at the perfect moment. 8 boars on standby for a dinner for a dozen people. That was the daily rhythm of the palace. Money spent like water. A club whose entire philosophy was to laugh in the face of death by feasting as if there were no tomorrow. And slowly, imperceptibly, the Roman general dissolved into an Eastern king. He wore the robes of a Greek monarch. He took the styling of a living god. He gave away his time, his loyalty, and increasingly his judgment to a foreign court. Back in Rome, his rival was watching all of it, collecting every detail, and building the most devastating propaganda campaign of the ancient world out of it. The message the young heir pushed relentlessly was simple and lethal. Your Roman general has been bewitched, unmanned, turned into the puppet of a scheming Eastern queen who means to rule Rome through him. He is no longer one of us. Then came the ceremony that handed the propaganda machine everything it could have dreamed of. In a grand public spectacle in Alexandria, the general gathered a crowd and staged a coronation of Cleopatra and her children. On a silver platform, on golden thrones, he seated the queen and her son by Caesar, the boy called Little Caesar, as co-rulers. And then he did the unthinkable. He carved up Roman-controlled territories of the East and simply gave them away to Cleopatra and to the children he'd fathered with her, crowning small children as kings and queens of lands and provinces. He dressed his own son by the queen as a Persian-style monarch, another as a Macedonian king, and proclaimed the boy Caesarion, the true son and heir of Julius Caesar. Think about how that landed in Rome. A Roman general, with no authority from the Senate or the people, had stood on a stage in a foreign capital and handed Roman lands to a foreign queen and her half-Egyptian children, and had named a boy as the real heir of Caesar, a direct challenge to the young man in Rome who based his entire claim to power on being Caesar's chosen heir. It was, to Roman eyes, a betrayal so total it barely needed exaggeration. But of course, it was exaggerated, endlessly, by the rival who now had all the ammunition he would ever need. And then that rival produced his masterstroke. He got hold of the general's will, or claimed he did, seized it from where it was stored with the priestesses who guarded such documents, carried it into the Senate, and read it aloud to the assembled leaders of Rome. In it, the will supposedly confirmed the gifts to Cleopatra's children, named the queen's son as Caesar's heir, and, the detail that turned Roman stomachs, declared that the general wished to be buried in Alexandria, beside Cleopatra, rather than in Rome. Historians have argued ever since about how much of that document was real and how much was invented or twisted to inflame the crowd. But it hardly mattered. The effect was exactly as intended. Rome erupted. Here was proof, they believed, that one of their own had abandoned his country entirely and given his soul to Egypt.
The young heir declared war. And notice the genius of how he framed it. He did not declare war on his Roman rival, which would have looked like just another round of the civil wars everyone was sick of. He declared war on Cleopatra, on the foreign queen. He made it Rome against Egypt, West against East, the Republic against the sorceress who had stolen a Roman general.
It was one of the most effective pieces of political spin in all of history. He turned a struggle between two Roman warlords into a patriotic crusade against a woman. Everything came down to a single day at sea. The two sides met off the western coast of Greece, in the waters near a place called Actium, in a naval battle that would decide the fate of the Roman world. Cleopatra's fleet fought alongside the generals. Her ships, her money, and her treasure were bound up in the whole enterprise. And then, in the middle of the battle, the Queen's squadron did something that has been argued over for 2,000 years. Her ships hoisted sail, broke away, and slipped through a gap in the fighting, running south for Egypt. And the general, seeing her go, abandoned his own fleet mid-battle and followed her. The Roman version, the one written by the winners, is scalding. The coward queen fled at the first sign of danger, and the besotted general threw away an empire to chase after her, leaving his men to be slaughtered. But historians have long suspected the truth was colder and more deliberate. The battle may already have been lost, or close to it. The escape may have been a prearranged plan to save the fleet's treasure and a core of ships so the war could be continued from Egypt. Some think the general's own strategy had collapsed, and the breakout was the only rational move left. What actually happened in the smoke off Actium, whether it was panic, love, or cold calculation, is something we will probably never fully untangle. What is certain is the result. The fleet was destroyed or surrendered. The war was effectively over. And the two of them fled back to Alexandria to face the end. Now stand in that palace on the harbor in the final days. The victorious heir is marching on Egypt with the full weight of Rome behind him. The army has melted away. The allies have switched sides. The famous drinking club, the society that had feasted in the face of death, quietly reinvented itself in these last weeks as a society of those about to die together. The same men and women, now toasting not to pleasure, but to the end they all knew was coming. The palace that had roasted 8 boars for a casual supper was now waiting for the axe to fall. The general fell first, and he fell on a lie. When the heir's forces closed in on Alexandria and resistance collapsed, a report reached him that Cleopatra was already dead. Whether she sent that word herself, and why, is one more thing the sources cannot agree on. But believing the queen he had thrown away an empire for was gone, the old Roman soldier did the one thing left to a defeated Roman commander. He fell on his sword. And then came the cruelest twist of the whole story. Cleopatra was not dead. She had shut herself inside her own monument, a fortified tomb she had built, packed with her treasure. When the dying general learned she still lived, he had himself carried to her, and the ancient accounts describe her and her women hauling his broken body up on ropes through an upper window of the sealed tomb, because she dared not open the doors. He died there, in her arms, inside the monument, and she was left alone, the last of the Ptolemies, sealed in a tomb full of gold in a conquered city, with the master of the Roman world at the gates. The heir wanted her alive. He had a very specific use for her. He intended to drag her back to Rome in chains and parade her through the streets in his triumph. The foreign queen humbled before the Roman people, the ultimate trophy of his victory. He put guards on her, kept her under close watch, played on her fears and her hopes to keep her from harming herself, because a dead Cleopatra was worth far less to him than a living one on display. She would not be his trophy. What happened next is the most famous death in ancient history, and, fittingly for her, one of the most mysterious. The story everyone knows is the asp, a venomous snake, an Egyptian cobra, supposedly smuggled to her hidden in a basket of figs, its bite bringing a swift and painless death. She arranged, the sources say, to be dressed in her full royal regalia, laid herself down on a golden couch, and when the guards broke into the sealed chamber, she was gone, and her women dying beside her. There was a symbolism in the snake she surely intended. The cobra was a sacred emblem of Egyptian royalty, worn on the crown of the pharaohs. If she chose it, she chose to die as a queen and a goddess, not as a captive. But even here, the truth slips through our fingers. The ancient writers themselves admitted no one really knew how she did it. Some said the snake was hidden in the figs. Some said in a water jar. Some said she had it brought some other way. Others said there was no snake at all, that she used a poison she carried in a hollow comb or a pin, a toxin she had, by some accounts, spent years studying, testing which mixtures killed quickly and without pain. Modern historians and toxicologists have pointed out that a cobra's bite is neither reliably quick nor painless, which makes the snake story doubtful on medical grounds. When the guards examined her body, the tale goes, they could find only 2 tiny marks that might have been fang punctures, or might have been nothing at all. Even the man who conquered her never learned the answer for certain. In his triumph in Rome, he could only parade an image of her, with a snake, because he could not parade the queen herself, and he could not even be sure how she had escaped him. And that is the final, perfect fact about Cleopatra. The last act of her life was to seize control of the one thing her enemy was most determined to take from her: the manner and meaning of her own death. He wanted her humiliated, alive, in chains. She died a queen, in her regalia, on her own terms, and left even the method a riddle that has never been solved. Her son, the boy she had named for Caesar, was hunted down and killed soon after, ending 3 centuries of the Ptolemies and thousands of years of pharaohs in a single stroke. Egypt became a Roman province. The victorious heir went home and, in time, became the first emperor of Rome. And it was his court poets and historians who wrote the version of Cleopatra we inherited: the seductress, the sorceress, the fatal woman who unmanned 2 great Romans. But look at what she actually did with the hand she was dealt. She inherited a bankrupt kingdom on a leash, a family that murdered its own, a throne stolen out from under her by a child and his handlers. She had herself smuggled through her own palace in a sack, made an ally of the most powerful man in the world, and got her crown back. When he was killed, she survived and did it again with the next master of Rome. For over 2 decades, she kept Egypt independent and rich, while every other kingdom around the Mediterranean was being swallowed whole. She outmaneuvered Caesar. She outlasted the general. She played the 2 most powerful men of her age like instruments, and the only Roman who ever beat her was the one who refused to meet her face to face, and fought her instead with a war of words, from a safe distance, because he understood something his predecessors had learned too late. She was never really a danger because of her beauty. She was a danger because she was the smartest person in almost every room she entered. And Rome could not forgive a woman for that. So they buried the mind under the myth. And the myth is what came down to us. The real woman was harder, sharper, and far more remarkable than the legend her enemies built to contain her. She lost in the end. but she chose how she lost. And 2,000 years later, we are still arguing about how she died, which means, in a way, she is still winning the last argument. If you made it all the way here, thank you for sitting with the real story instead of the myth. And if you want more history told the way it actually happened, subscribe and stay with the channel, because there are more forgotten kings, doomed queens, and buried truths waiting to be pulled back into the light. The past is stranger and far more human than any legend we've wrapped around it.